Welcome to the Sleepy Christian, a place where you can rest your mind and calm your spirit as we drift into the gentle truths of Scripture. Tonight, we reflect on a powerful yet quiet moment in the Bible, the whisper that woke the prophet Elijah. Elijah had seen fire fall from heaven, had stood boldly before kings, and yet, in his deepest sorrow and exhaustion, it was not thunder, lightning, or earthquakes that reached him. It was a still, small voice. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Let us know in the comments, whether you're curled up in bed in Texas, listening from a quiet cabin in Canada, or somewhere far across the sea. May you find peace in tonight's story. Now close your eyes and let's begin. Elijah was tired. So very tired. Not the kind of tired you feel after a long day, but the deep exhaustion that seeps into the soul. He had just come down from Mount Carmel, where fire from heaven had blazed through the sky at his prayer, proving to the people that the Lord was God. It had been a moment of triumph, of power, of glory, and yet, shortly after, everything seemed to fall apart. Queen Jezebel, furious at the death of her prophets, sent a message that struck Elijah's heart like a sword. "By this time tomorrow, I will make you like one of them." A threat soaked in vengeance. And though Elijah had just seen the miraculous hand of God, though he had stood before crowds and kings alike, fear overtook him. He ran, not just a short escape, not a moment to catch his breath. He fled far, across the land, across the days, until his legs gave out beneath him. He ran, not just from Jezebel, but from everything, from his calling, from the weight of expectation, from the fear, from the very mission he had been given. Because sometimes, even the strongest among us collapse. Even prophets need to hide. Alone in the wilderness, Elijah's steps finally faltered. The adrenaline that had once carried him gave way to silence. He wandered into the emptiness, into a desert not just of sand and rock, but of the soul. He came to a broom tree, a solitary shrub under the scorching sun. It offered almost no shade, no comfort, yet he sank beneath it anyway. And there, Elijah whispered the words that many of us have thought but rarely say aloud. "It is enough. I've had enough, Lord." This wasn't just weariness. It was despair, the kind that makes you feel invisible, insignificant, forgotten. He had fought so hard, spoken so boldly, trusted so deeply, and now, it all felt meaningless. He believed he had failed, that his work had been for nothing, that he was alone in a nation that no longer wanted truth. He wasn't just running from Jezebel, he was running from himself, from the burden of being a voice, crying in the wilderness, from the hope that had turned to ashes, from the fear that maybe, just maybe, God was no longer listening. And so Elijah asked to die. That's the part of the story we often skip over. We remember the fire from heaven, the mighty miracles, the confrontation with evil, but we forget this moment under the broom tree, where a broken man begged God to let him go. Not with anger, but with exhaustion. Not with rebellion, but with surrender. And yet, even here, in the rawness of his pain, Elijah did something holy. He brought his despair to God. He didn't pretend to be fine. He didn't wrap his grief in pious words. He simply laid it at the feet of the one who knew him best. And then he slept. That sacred, wordless surrender. The letting go. The falling into divine arms without needing answers. Sometimes, that's the holiest thing we can do. In that sleep, beneath a thorny tree in the middle of nowhere, Elijah was not abandoned. Heaven was watching. God did not shame him. God did not scold him. Instead, God prepared something quiet, something gentle, something unexpected. But that part comes later. For now, there is only stillness. The kind of stillness that holds a man who's run out of strength. The kind of stillness that says, "You are still mine, even now." And somewhere in that silence, the whisper was beginning to form. The desert night had fallen quiet around Elijah, wrapping him in a cool stillness beneath the stars. The broom tree above him offered little shelter, just a thin scattering of leaves clinging to its wiry branches. But it was enough to collapse beneath, enough to weep beneath, enough to give up beneath. Elijah lay on the dry ground, motionless. The ache in his body had settled deep into his bones, and the weariness of his soul was even heavier. It had not been an ordinary journey. He had crossed rugged terrain and burning plains, with a heart full of fear and sorrow, chased by the echo of Jezebel's threat and his own inner torment. Now, under this tree, in the emptiness of the wilderness, Elijah whispered into the darkness words only the broken dare speak. "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life." There was no rage in his tone, no dramatics, only the sound of a man who had reached the end of his strength, the end of his hope, the end of himself. He didn't ask to be rescued. He didn't ask for a miracle. He simply wanted to stop, to disappear into the dust, to fade from the burden of being God's prophet. He believed he was alone, useless, forgotten, and perhaps, somewhere deep down, Elijah thought God might finally agree. But the God of Elijah is not like the world. The world praises strength, demands constant productivity, and grows impatient with those who fall apart. But God is different. As Elijah drifted into an exhausted sleep, something miraculous began to unfold. Quietly, gently, invisibly. There were no trumpets, no fanfare, no blaze of light. Just the brush of unseen wings, the hush of divine presence descending. An angel approached him, not to judge, not to lecture, not even to speak, at least, not yet. The angel simply touched him. A soft, wordless gesture. A touch not of correction, but of compassion. A heavenly hand reaching down to a prophet who no longer had the strength to reach up. Then came the voice, tender and calm, "Get up and eat." Before him was bread, warm and fragrant, baked on hot stones, and a jar of water, cool and refreshing. Simple things, earthly things, but divine in their timing. Heaven had come not with lightning, but with breakfast. Elijah did not ask for it. He had not prayed for food. But God, who knows what we need before we even speak, provided it. And not only that, he honored Elijah's need to rest. The prophet ate, drank, and then laid down again. No urgency, no push to move, no command to continue, just rest. That too was holy. Because sometimes, when we are most broken, God doesn't give us a sermon. He gives us sleep. He gives us food. He gives us the grace to stop. And he lets us know, you are still loved. So Elijah slept again. And once more, the angel came. A second time, with the same kindness, the same touch, the same voice. "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." What a sentence. So simple and yet overflowing with compassion. The journey is too much for you. Not a rebuke, but an acknowledgement. God was not disappointed in Elijah's weakness. He wasn't surprised by it. He saw it. He understood it. And he made provision for it. Because the God who calls us to great tasks also knows when we are too tired to take the next step. And in those moments, He does not abandon us. He nourishes us. He reminds us that He is near, especially when we feel furthest away. That morning in the wilderness was not about power or prophecy or purpose. It was about tenderness, about a broken man and a God who knelt beside him, about bread in the desert, water for the weary, and the kind of love that shows up not with answers, but with presence. Elijah, once the bold voice of fire and judgment, was now simply a man beneath a tree. And even in that place of emptiness, God whispered through the silence, "I see you, I know, and I'm still with you." Sometimes, the holiest moments are not the ones filled with thunder, but the ones where you are too tired to stand, and God feeds you anyway. The fire was small, just a few glowing coals surrounded by stones. It wasn't much, but it was enough to warm a flat piece of bread laid carefully over them. Bread not made by human hands, but by an angel. In the stillness of the early morning, the aroma drifted through the air, warm, comforting, unmistakably nourishing. The kind of smell that awakens more than just the body. It reaches into the soul and reminds it that life is still worth living. Elijah stirred. His eyes fluttered open slowly, not with the jolt of fear or duty, but with the gentle fog of someone who had rested deeply for the first time in what felt like forever. His back still ached from the ground beneath him, and the desert air clung to his skin. But something was different. There, beside him, was a small cake of bread baked on hot stones, and next to it, a jar of water, clean, cool, waiting. No one else was in sight. There was no camp, no bustling crowd, no caravan of travelers, just him and this food. Quiet, personal, providential. It's hard to describe what a small act of kindness can mean when you're in the depths of despair. But Elijah knew. In that moment, he realized that someone, God himself, had not only found him in the middle of nowhere, but had prepared something just for him. Not a vision, not a thunderous command, but a meal. And not just any meal. This was bread, baked by angels. He reached out slowly, as if afraid it might vanish, like a dream slipping through his fingers. The bread was still warm, its surface slightly crisp, its inside soft and filling. Every bite carried not just nourishment, but meaning. Every mouthful whispered a message that Elijah's heart had longed to hear. You are not forgotten. You are still loved. The water was fresh, unlike the dry air or the cracked earth around him. It washed over his parched throat, reminding him of rivers and rain, of provision and life. And as he ate and drank, his strength began to return. Not all at once, but slowly, like the sun rising over a long, dark night. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say. What words could capture the ache in his bones or the comfort of being fed by heaven? After he finished, he laid back down again. Not because he was still lost in despair, but because he was still healing. God did not rush him. There was no, now go. There was only rest. Elijah wasn't ready yet, and God knew that. So once more, Elijah slept, and once more, the angel returned. The presence was not loud or demanding. It was gentle, kind, as though God had bent all of heaven toward this one man lying in the dust, as though all the galaxies paused to care for a tired prophet beneath a tree. The angel touched him again and spoke words that must have lingered in Elijah's spirit long after the moment passed. Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. Not, you should be stronger. Not, you're disappointing God. Not, you're failing your mission. But, the journey is too much for you. God saw him, every mile he had walked, every fear that haunted him, every burden that pressed against his heart. God didn't deny the weight. He acknowledged it. He honored it. and he met it with mercy. The second meal was just as sacred as the first. The bread filled Elijah's stomach, yes, but more than that, it filled a void in his spirit. A void carved out by loneliness, fear, and fatigue. And the water, it ran through him like grace, like mercy, undeserved but freely given. He sat for a while after eating, not rushing, not panicking, just breathing. The landscape around him hadn't changed. The problems that had driven him into the wilderness hadn't vanished. Jezebel still sat on her throne. Israel was still divided. The work still remained. But something inside of Elijah was changing. Because when God bakes bread for you in the wilderness, when he feeds you not with commands but with compassion, something begins to shift. The soul, once heavy with despair, remembers how to hope. The heart, once numb with fear, begins to stir, and the body, once too weary to take another step, prepares to rise again. This moment, this quiet, holy pause in the desert, was not a detour, it was the miracle. The fire on Mount Carmel was dramatic. The whisper on Mount Horeb would be life-changing. But here, in the space between those two peaks, was bread, simple, sacred, sustaining. God didn't just rescue Elijah, he restored him. One bite at a time, one sip at a time, one whisper of grace at a time. And perhaps that's how God works with all of us. Not always with fire from heaven, but with warm bread in the wilderness, with food baked by angels, with love that meets us exactly where we are, even when we're lying beneath a tree, ready to give up. Elijah rose slowly, the sleep still clinging to him like a blanket of dust. But something within him had changed. The despair hadn't vanished, nor had the weight of his fears, but his steps no longer dragged with hopelessness. There was purpose now, fragile though it was, restored by the bread of heaven and the water of mercy. The angel's words still echoed softly in his ears. The journey is too much for you. And yet, God had not turned him back. He had nourished him for the very journey that once seemed impossible. And so, Elijah began to walk. The wilderness stretched before him like a vast and unforgiving sea, rolling dunes, jagged stones, and dry wind that whispered nothing but silence. There were no crowds here, no cities, no companions, just earth and sky, just the breath of God carried faintly on the wind. He walked by day under the scorching sun, and by night beneath a sky littered with stars, those same stars God had once pointed out to Abraham, promising descendants as numerous as their lights. 40 days, 40 nights. Each step was a kind of prayer, not one spoken aloud, but one lived through aching feet and tired legs. His sandals wore thin, his robe, tattered by the thorny brush, whipped around his ankles as he pressed onward. No shortcuts, no miracles to carry him, just this, step after step, day after day. He was walking to Mount Horeb, the same mountain where Moses had once stood, barefoot before a burning bush, the place where the law had been given, the mountain where God had carved commandments into stone. Elijah wasn't just walking to a location. He was walking toward history, toward the roots of his faith, toward the place where God had once spoken clearly and powerfully. Perhaps, somewhere in the back of his mind, he hoped God might speak again. But the journey itself was a kind of revelation. In the silence of the desert, Elijah was stripped of distraction. He had no crowd to preach to, no king to confront, no fire to cool down. He had only the whisper of wind, the crunch of sand underfoot, and the steady rhythm of his breath. The same God who had once answered him with fire was now leading him through nothingness, but not absence. There is a difference. Because sometimes God speaks most clearly, not through noise, but through the long silence that invites us to listen. Each sunrise was a reminder that he was still alive. Each sunset, a quiet benediction. There were moments when his strength waned again, when his legs trembled under the strain, and yet he did not stop. Because he had not been called to victory, he had been called to continue. And in that long walk, Elijah began to learn something about the nature of divine restoration. That it doesn't come all at once, that it isn't always glorious or immediate. Sometimes it comes through the quiet discipline of walking forward, even when the road offers no encouragement. That to be faithful does not always mean to be strong, it means to keep going. He remembered the faces of the people on Mount Carmel, how they had shouted, "The Lord, He is God," after the fire fell. And he wondered, where were they now? Had they changed? Had their hearts truly turned? Or had the fire faded just as quickly as it came? He thought of Jezebel's threat, the venom in her words, and how even a single sentence had driven him into the wilderness. He wondered why courage is so quick to vanish, and why fear has such a loud voice in the heart of even the faithful. But above all, Elijah wondered if God still had use for him. He had not been given a new mission. No voice from the clouds had summoned him to Horeb. There had only been an angel, bread, water, and rest. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps God wasn't calling Elijah to do anything grand yet. Perhaps he was calling him simply to come, to return to the place where God had spoken before, to return to the place where the covenant had been made, to return to the mountain where presence had once burned like fire and rumbled like thunder. Elijah didn't know what he would find there. He didn't know what God would say, or if he would say anything at all. But something deep within him believed that when God feeds you in the wilderness, he's not just restoring your strength, he's calling you closer. The walk was long, yes. Painful, yes. But sacred. Because somewhere in those 40 days and 40 nights, Elijah was not just traveling across a desert. He was crossing the terrain of his own heart, leaving behind the fear that had paralyzed him, leaving behind the shame of feeling like a failure, leaving behind the illusion that strength meant never growing weary, and arriving slowly, step by step, at the truth that even prophets fall, that even heroes break, but God still walks with them. Not in thunder, not in fire, but in silence, in steady provision, in long, unremarkable journeys through empty spaces that are not empty at all, but full of grace waiting to be discovered. By the time Elijah saw the distant outline of Mount Horeb rising against the desert horizon, he was no longer the same man who had collapsed beneath the broom tree. He was still tired, he was still uncertain, but he was ready to listen, ready to stand before the presence of the one who does not abandon his children, even when they run. The mountain loomed before Elijah, ancient and silent. Mount Horeb, also called Sinai, the place where the voice of God had once thundered, where Moses had stood trembling before a bush that burned without being consumed, where clouds and lightning had wrapped the summit in mystery. Elijah had arrived, not in a chariot of fire, but by worn feet and quiet obedience. Every step of his 40-day journey now led him here, to this sacred place where the divine had touched the earth. And yet, when he arrived, there were no voices, no visions, no thunder, just the wind brushing across the rocky ground and the distant cry of the desert. There was no immediate sign that God was waiting. Elijah looked up at the mountain, his eyes tracing the jagged path toward its caves. He must have felt both anticipation and hesitation. What would he find? Would God still speak to him after all his fear, after all his doubt, after asking for death under a lonely tree? He found a cave in the side of the mountain and stepped inside. The air was cool and dry, and the silence inside wrapped around him like a blanket. It was a place to hide, a place to be still. And for a man whose soul had been battered by storms both within and without, it was a kind of refuge. Elijah had come to the end of his journey, but he was still waiting, still wondering, still aching with questions too heavy to speak aloud. He sat alone in the darkness, letting the mountain's silence press in around him. And in that moment of stillness, the word of the Lord came, not as a fire or a wind, but as a question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God's voice did not demand. It did not accuse. It asked. A quiet question, filled with intimacy. Not because God didn't know the answer, but because he wanted Elijah to say it, to release what was hidden, to speak what had been building within his heart for so long. Elijah didn't hesitate. The words poured out of him, like water breaking through a dam. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." There it was, the confession, the sorrow, the exhaustion, the loneliness. He wasn't just recounting the facts, he was exposing his soul. Elijah was a prophet who had tried with all his might to pull his nation back to truth, to restore the broken covenant between God and his people. He had watched the altars fall, the sacred traditions crumble, and his fellow prophets be hunted and slaughtered. And now, with all that pain inside him, he cried out, "I'm alone." That was the wound, the deep one. Not just fear of Jezebel, not just disappointment in the people, but the bone-deep ache of isolation. Elijah believed he was the last, the only faithful one left, surrounded by a world that had forgotten God and determined to silence those who still remembered. He had carried the weight of an entire nation's rebellion on his back, and now, in this cave, it came spilling out. What a mercy that God let him speak. He didn't interrupt, didn't correct. He simply asked, "What are you doing here?" And then he listened. He allowed Elijah to bring all his frustration, his grief, his despair into the open. Because before healing can come, the wound must be named. God was not angry with Elijah for breaking down. He had fed him when he was hungry. He had let him sleep when he was tired. And now, he let him speak when he was broken. This is the God who meets us not at the height of our strength, but in the quiet cave of our surrender. And yet, Elijah's words were soaked in misunderstanding. He thought he was the only one. He thought the fire had failed. He thought his life's work had come to nothing. But God knew better. God always knows the bigger picture we can't see. So what did God do next? He didn't respond with a counter-argument. He didn't correct Elijah with a list of facts. Instead, he invited Elijah to see, to stand, to step out of the cave and witness something holy. God was about to speak, not through theology or rebuke, but through experience, through the raw power of creation, through presence. And soon, Elijah would come to understand that being alone is not the same as being abandoned, and silence is not the same as absence. But for now, in that cave, Elijah waited, and God waited with him. Because sometimes, before the whisper comes, we must first name the silence. Elijah stood at the mouth of the cave, the stone cold beneath his feet. The stillness of the mountain pressed in around him, vast and ancient. His breath was shallow, his body tired, but his heart waited. He had poured out his soul in the darkness, confessed his fears, his loneliness, his sorrow. Now, God had told him to come out and stand before him, for the Lord was about to pass by. Elijah didn't know what that would mean. He didn't know if it would be like the days of Moses, when clouds and thunder cloaked the summit. He didn't know if it would be like Carmel, when fire fell from heaven and consumed the altar in one blazing moment of glory. But he knew this: God was near. Suddenly, the wind rose, not a breeze, but a roar. A great and mighty wind tore across the mountain, so strong it shattered rocks into pieces. The air screamed around Elijah, howling through the cliffs and valleys with terrifying force. Dust and debris flew like arrows. The very mountains seemed to tremble beneath the violence of it. Elijah stood still. Surely, this must be the Lord. What else could command the wind with such fury? What else could rip through stone as though it were paper? What else could shake the very earth with its breath? But God was not in the wind. The wind passed. Its roar died down into a whisper of dust. Silence returned, briefly, before the next fury came. The ground beneath Elijah's feet began to heave. The rocks groaned. The cave behind him cracked and trembled. The mountain rolled with the deep growl of the earth moving. An earthquake. The kind of deep, gut-rattling tremor that makes the strongest hearts shudder. The kind of shaking that reminds all of creation how small it truly is. But God was not in the earthquake. Elijah waited again. The dust settled. The trembling stilled. The echo of broken stone faded into the air. And then came fire. It rushed across the horizon like a living beast. Flames leapt from rock to rock, devouring brush and scorching the earth. The heat wrapped around the cave, waves of it pulsing like a heartbeat. Fire, the very element Elijah had once called down from heaven. He knew fire. He had seen it fall and prove God's power. He had seen it consume falsehood and ignite belief. Fire meant judgment. Fire meant clarity. Fire was holy. But God was not in the fire. Elijah was alone again. The mountain returned to silence. The wind was gone. The earth was still. The flames had cooled into ash. And there he stood, weathered by the elements, hollowed by awe, yet still waiting. And then it came, a sound. Not a shout, not a crack, not a blast of divine trumpet, but a whisper, a still, small voice, so soft it could barely be heard, so gentle it could be missed altogether. It didn't shake the mountain. It didn't need to. It didn't tear through the rocks or burn the trees. It came in quiet. It came in peace. It came in love. Elijah covered his face with his cloak, not from the wind or the fire or the fear of falling rocks, but from the presence of holiness too pure to behold. He stepped out, trembling, not with terror, but with reverence. God was here, and not in the way Elijah had expected, not in power, not in spectacle, not in a repeat of Carmel's firestorm. God had chosen the whisper. The still, small voice was not weak. It was sacred. It was intentional. It said something deeper than thunder ever could. I am near not just in miracles, but in silence. Not just in might, but in mercy. Elijah had believed that only fire could prove God's presence, that only overwhelming signs could show that the Lord was still at work. But the whisper said otherwise. The whisper said, "You don't have to be loud to be heard." The whisper said, "You don't have to see fire to know I am with you." The whisper said, "I was with you beneath the broom tree. I was with you on every step of the journey. I was with you in the cave, and I am with you now." Elijah had been broken. He had wanted to die. He had felt utterly alone. But God had not abandoned him. He had drawn closer than ever, not in shouts or flames, but in the quiet intimacy of a voice that required Elijah to lean in, to listen, to trust. Because God does not always shout to get our attention. Sometimes he whispers to draw us near. And perhaps that was what Elijah needed most. Not power, not spectacle, but presence. A quiet reassurance that even when the world rages with storms and threats and fear, God is still close, still speaking, still loving. So Elijah stood, cloaked in silence and awe, listening to the voice that did not tear, or burn, or shake, but healed. The voice of the whisper, the voice of God. Elijah stood utterly still, his face covered by the edge of his cloak, the silence of the mountain pressing in around him. The fire had passed, the earthquake had quieted, the wind had died away. All the grand, violent displays that might signal divine presence had come and gone. And then, after everything had fallen silent, after creation had exhausted its roaring, there came something softer, something holier than power, a whisper. So quiet, it could have been mistaken for the wind brushing against stone. So faint, it may have seemed like the echo of one's own breath. But Elijah knew this was no natural sound. This was the voice of God. Not in fire, not in wind, not in trembling earth, but in stillness. It is difficult to describe what it means to truly hear God in a whisper. We expect the divine to come with force, to make his presence undeniable, to part seas and shake mountains. We think we need signs and wonders, thundering voices from the sky. But here, in this moment, Elijah learned something different, something that would shift the very foundation of his understanding. God doesn't always show up in the noise. Sometimes he arrives in silence, not to demonstrate his power, but to reveal his nearness. The whisper did not demand attention. It didn't overpower Elijah. It invited him. The kind of voice that speaks when the shouting stops, when the world finally grows quiet enough to listen. The kind of voice that says, "I am not far off. I am here, and I have been here all along." Elijah had run because he was afraid. He had fled because he felt alone. He had hidden in a cave because the burden of being God's prophet had grown too heavy. But in the whisper, God answered the question behind every one of Elijah's fears. "Are you still with me?" "Yes. Yes, I am." The whisper carried no rebuke, no sharp correction. It didn't say, "You failed." It didn't say, "You should have been stronger." It didn't say, "Where was your faith?" It said, "I see you. I know you. I'm still speaking to you." That whisper was everything Elijah needed. In his despair, he had asked to die. In his exhaustion, he had believed he was finished. But God did not respond to Elijah's desperation with punishment. He responded with presence. The kind of presence that does not overwhelm, but heals. The kind that slips past our defenses and meets us in the most tender places of our heart. It's one thing to see God in the fire. It's another to recognize him in the whisper. The whisper means God is close, closer than the chaos, closer than the fear, closer than the storm that chased Elijah into the wilderness. It means God is not just above the noise of the world. He is within the silence of your soul. He speaks in ways we can only hear when we stop striving, stop running, stop yelling for answers, and simply listen. And so, Elijah listened. The prophet who had once called fire from heaven now stood quiet before the God who chose to come near in gentleness. No one else was watching. There was no crowd to impress. This was not for the sake of spectacle. This was intimacy. The whisper reached past Elijah's fear, past his shame, past his doubt. It touched the part of him that had believed he was alone. It told him that his journey had not been in vain, that his obedience mattered, that even in hiding he had been held. In that whisper, Elijah's soul heard what it had been aching to believe. You are not forgotten. "You are not finished, and you are not alone." What Elijah discovered in that moment is something many of us forget, that sometimes God speaks not to move the mountains around us, but to move the mountains within us, not to shake the earth, but to shake us free from despair, not to show off his might, but to restore our hearts. Because the deepest healing comes not from dramatic signs, but from quiet assurance. And that is what the whisper gave. In a single breath, in the gentlest voice, God reminded Elijah who he was. Not just the God of fire and law and miracles, but the God of presence, the God of peace, the God who speaks softly because he is close enough to whisper. And if he whispered to Elijah, he can whisper to you, in your weariness, in your sadness, in your wandering. He comes not always with thunder, but with tenderness. Not always with answers, but with nearness. So listen, when the fire fades and the wind's quiet and the earth stands still, listen. You just might hear the whisper that wakes your soul. Elijah remained standing near the mouth of the cave, his face still hidden in the folds of his mantle, the echo of the whisper lingering in the still air. It had not been a loud voice, but it had shaken something deeper than wind or fire ever could. It had pierced the veil between despair and hope. Elijah knew now. God had spoken, not to condemn, but to comfort, not to demand more from him, but to remind him of something he had forgotten in his fear and sorrow, that he was still held, still known, still part of a divine story that had not ended. And then the voice spoke again, not as a whisper this time, but as a question that invited restoration. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It was the same question God had asked earlier, before the wind, before the earthquake, before the fire. But now, it landed differently. Elijah was no longer just the prophet hiding in a cave. He was the man who had heard God's whisper. And even so, Elijah's answer was the same. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty," he said. "The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." Still the same sorrow, still the same isolation. Elijah was honest. He did not pretend to be stronger than he was. He didn't hide behind formal language or try to mask his pain. He spoke from the wound, from the ache of having given everything and still feeling like it hadn't been enough. But this time, the response would be different. God did not argue with Elijah's pain. He didn't try to dismiss it. He didn't tell him to cheer up or have more faith. He didn't accuse him of weakness or failure. Instead, God gave him something better than a feeling. He gave him a purpose. "Go back the way you came," God said. "Return to the desert of Damascus. Go back." The words must have landed with surprise. Elijah had fled, believing his journey was over. He had laid down under the broom tree to die. He had hidden in a cave to escape. But now, God was sending him back, not as punishment, but as a commission, because the whisper was not only a comfort, it was a calling. God laid out a plan. He told Elijah to anoint Hazael as king over Aram, Jehu as king over Israel, and Elisha as his prophetic successor. These were not random instructions. They were God's way of saying, "You are not done. There is still work to do, and I have already prepared the next chapter." Elijah had believed he was the last faithful man in Israel, but God revealed the truth. "I reserve 7,000 in Israel," the Lord said, "all whose knees have not bowed to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him." 7,000. 7,000 hidden in quiet faithfulness. 7,000 who had not compromised. 7,000 who, like Elijah, had remained loyal, though Elijah hadn't seen them. He had felt alone, but he had not been alone. That was the quiet correction within the whisper, not a harsh rebuke, but a soft unveiling of a larger truth. You are not the center of the story. You are a part of it, a sacred, chosen part, but not the whole. God had been moving all along, in places Elijah couldn't see, in hearts Elijah didn't know. And now, God invited him to move with him again, not in his own strength, but in renewed trust, not fueled by fear or urgency, but by the knowledge that he was not alone. The instructions God gave Elijah were more than logistical. They were spiritual restoration in action. Go anoint kings, raise up the next prophet, rejoin the work I am already doing. It's a picture of divine reassurance. God doesn't just comfort us in our pain, He reintegrates us into His purpose. He doesn't say, rest forever, nor does He say, carry it all again by yourself. He says, walk with me, I've already gone ahead. Elijah must have felt something lift inside him. Not all at once, perhaps. Not in a blaze of certainty, but something had shifted. The man who wanted to die now had direction. The prophet who believed he was finished now had instructions. The one who thought he was alone now knew he was part of something far greater than his own weary perspective. And so Elijah began to descend the mountain, not with fanfare, not with miracles, but with a renewed sense of quiet strength. He had been broken, and God had fed him. He had been lost, and God had found him. He had been overwhelmed, and God had spoken, not in rage, but in a whisper. It is easy to think that God only moves in the dramatic, that He only works through victory and power. But Elijah had learned something far more beautiful, that sometimes God is most present in the quiet spaces of our collapse, in the cave, in the question, in the whisper that follows the storm. The instructions God gave Elijah were also a gift of transition. By calling him to anoint Elisha, God was gently preparing him for the future, for the handing off of the burden he had carried alone for too long. He was not meant to do it forever. He was not meant to do it alone, and now another would walk beside him and eventually take up the mantle. That too was mercy. God does not just send us out. He surrounds us. He prepares others to join us. He reminds us that the story does not rest on our shoulders, but on His. Elijah's journey back would not be easy. The dangers had not disappeared. The kings were still corrupt. Jezebel still breathed. The nation was still fractured. But now, he was no longer walking as a man running away. He was walking as a man sent by God, sent with quiet assurance, sent with divine presence, sent by the whisper that had woken his soul. As Elijah made his way down the mountain, the world must have felt different, not because the landscape had changed, but because something inside him had. He had been met not by punishment, but by mercy, not by spectacle, but by a whisper. And now, he carried more than just instructions. He carried the quiet knowledge that he was not alone. For so long, Elijah had believed he was the last one, the only voice of truth left in a nation that had bowed to Baal. He had looked around at the shattered altars, at the silence of the people, at the rage of the throne, and he had drawn a conclusion from the evidence before his eyes. I alone am left. It is one of the deepest pains of the faithful soul to believe that your devotion is solitary, that you alone see clearly, love deeply, fight truthfully, that the light you carry flickers against a sea of darkness with no others beside you. Elijah's grief had been more than fear. It had been loneliness. Not just the absence of safety, but the absence of fellowship. But in the clearest moment of divine speech, the moment after the fire and the wind and the quake, God had revealed the truth. I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him. 7,000. Elijah hadn't seen them. He hadn't heard their voices. They had not stood beside him on Mount Carmel, shouting, "The Lord, He is God." They had not walked with him through the wilderness. They had not appeared at the cave. But they were there, quietly faithful, hidden, perhaps, in fear, silently resisting the pull of the culture around them, choosing loyalty to God in their homes, in their hearts, in ways that never made headlines or firefall spectacles. 7,000. It was a gentle correction, not to shame Elijah, but to widen his vision. He had mistaken isolation for uniqueness. He had confused silence for absence, but God was working in places Elijah could not see. This is how God often moves, not just in prophets who call down fire, but in the quiet faithfulness of unnamed men and women who refuse to bow, in mothers raising children to know the truth in secret corners of a corrupt world, in farmers who kneel in prayer before tilling dry earth, in old men who whisper the Shema when no one is listening, in small acts of resistance to evil that seem invisible to the world, but not to God. We often think that impact is measured in volume, that to matter is to be loud, noticed, praised. But God was showing Elijah and showing us that the kingdom is upheld by the quiet, the hidden, the steadfast. The 7,000 had not sought attention. They had not challenged kings, but they had remained faithful. They had not bent the knee. And that mattered. It mattered enough for God to point it out. It mattered enough for him to say to his weary prophet, "You are not alone." Imagine what those words must have meant to Elijah. He had laid down under a tree and begged for death because he thought there was no one else. He had cried out from the cave, full of pain, because he believed he was the last thread holding everything together. But now he knew he was part of something larger. He was not the last light in the world. He was one among thousands whose hearts still beat for the living God. There is strength in knowing you are not alone. The loneliness didn't vanish completely. The work ahead would still be hard. But now, Elijah walked with a deeper assurance. He was not God's only witness. He was not the only one resisting the tide of idolatry and compromise. He was part of a remnant, a hidden remnant, yes, but real and chosen and precious. And what God whispered to Elijah, he whispers still, to the mother who feels unnoticed in her prayers, to the student who walks into a classroom where no one else seems to care about truth, to the pastor who feels the weight of leading a congregation through a culture that no longer wants the gospel, to the artist, the teacher, the caregiver, the thinker, the builder, the believer who holds on quietly in a noisy world. You are not alone. You are not the only one. There are others, many others. And even if they're not beside you now, God sees them. He has reserved them. He is holding them as surely as He is holding you. This is the secret strength of the faithful. Not the assurance that we will always see results, or that we will always feel encouraged, or that the world will ever applaud us, but the deep, quiet knowledge that God is still working, that even when we are tired, He is still planting seeds, that even when we are hiding in caves, He is raising up others, that even when our vision is small, His purpose is vast. Elijah had thought the story was ending, but God was just turning the page, and the next chapter would not be his alone to carry, because in every generation, God keeps a remnant, a people unknown to the world, but fully known to Him. And that is how revival comes, not always with thunder, but through the steady pulse of 7,000 hearts who will not bow. There are moments in life when the noise of the world finally fades, and what remains is silence. Not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that feels sacred. The kind of silence that speaks. That's the silence Elijah experienced when the whisper of God came and cut through his despair like a light through thick fog. And though the fire had not restored him, and the earthquake had not lifted him, and the wind had not moved him, the whisper did. Because the whisper wasn't just a voice, it was an invitation. It was God saying, "Come closer." It was God saying, "I have not forgotten you." And it was God saying, "Even now, in your lowest moment, I am calling your name." When God whispers, it is never random. He does not whisper to impress. He does not whisper to confuse. He whispers because he is near. He whispers because he is not a distant deity, standing on a cloud, demanding your obedience from afar. He is a father, sitting beside you, leaning in, speaking softly so that your heart will listen. You don't whisper to people who are far away. You whisper to those who are close, and that is what Elijah learned on the mountain. Not just that God could speak, but that God wanted to speak to him. Not just to the crowd, not just to a nation, not just through miracles or thunder, but personally, gently, in a voice that was meant only for him. We often imagine that the voice of God must come with weight and noise, with force and drama. We look for signs in the sky, for fire from heaven, for messages written in lightning. But what if God's most powerful voice is the quietest one? What if he doesn't shout to get your attention because he's already standing beside you? What if the whisper is the proof that he's close? When you are overwhelmed by life, when your prayers feel unanswered, when you sit in your own cave of confusion and sorrow, listen for the whisper. When everyone else's voice is louder than God's, when your fear screams louder than your faith, when your hope fades under the pressure of the world's chaos, listen for the whisper. Because the whisper is still speaking. It may come when you are alone and tired. It may come after you've said, "I can't take another step." It may come after your tears have dried and your strength is gone. It may come when you least expect it, and certainly when you don't think you deserve it. But it comes, and when it does, it brings more than comfort. It brings direction. The whisper is not only God saying, "I see you." It is God saying, "I'm sending you." Because God never heals you just to leave you in one place. He restores you so he can move through you again. That's what happened to Elijah. The whisper didn't end his story. It awakened it. It reignited his calling, not with thunder, but with clarity, and not with burdens, but with purpose. The journey that once felt too much now had a reason. The pain that once felt pointless now had context. The loneliness that once felt suffocating now gave way to the truth that Elijah was not, and had never been, alone. And so Elijah went, down from the mountain, back into the world, back into the uncertainty and the chaos, but not as the same man. He went with the whisper still echoing in his soul. That whisper was enough. That whisper carried more strength than the fire, more truth than the earthquake, more guidance than the wind. It carried the voice of the living God, close, tender, steady. You may never hear God shout in your lifetime. You may not see mountains split, or fire fall, or seas part. But if you still your heart, if you lean in, if you listen when everything else goes quiet, you may hear the whisper. And if you do, you'll know. It was never about noise. It was never about proving yourself. It was never about being strong enough or loud enough or holy enough. It was always about nearness. God has been drawing near to his people since the beginning, in gardens, in deserts, in upper rooms and quiet hillsides, in prisons and palaces and caves. He has always come near, not to impress, but to invite, to walk with you, to restore you, to remind you of who you are. and of who He is. The whisper is not the end of your journey, it's the beginning. It is the voice that speaks when all others fall silent. It is the voice that calls the broken, the afraid, the weary, and says, "Come, I still have work for you. I still have love for you. I am not finished with your story." So when the world grows quiet, and your heart aches with uncertainty, and your soul searches the sky for fire, lean in, wait, listen, because the whisper that woke Elijah is still speaking, and it might be calling your name.